February 1946. A converted courtroom in Shanghai, China. The room smells of damp plaster and cigarette smoke. Wooden chairs have been arranged in rows. A long table sits at the front, where 5 American military officers serving as the commission take their seats. At the defense table, 4 Japanese officers sit in pressed uniforms, their faces composed, their hands folded. They have been told what this proceeding is about. They know what is coming. They have prepared their answers. And then a thin American officer in a pressed uniform walks through a side door and sits down in the wooden witness chair. His name is Chase J. Nielsen. He is 29 years old. He is a navigator. He has a degree in civil engineering from Utah State University. And 3.5 years ago, in this same city, Japanese military police held him down on his back, placed a towel over his face, and poured water into his nose and mouth until he felt, in his own words, more or less like he was drowning, just gasping between life and death. He has come back. That is the part that the 4 Japanese officers sitting at the defense table cannot quite process. They are watching a man they once held in a cage walk into a courtroom of his own free will to describe what they did to him. He was not ordered to return to Shanghai. He was not compelled by subpoena. He could have stayed in Utah with his family. He could have tried to forget Shanghai, and the water, and the cell, and the men who did not survive in the cells next to his. Instead, he is here, sitting 12 feet from the men who tortured him, and he is about to answer questions in a calm, factual voice that will, over the next several weeks, dismantle a silence the Japanese military had maintained for nearly 4 years. Because that is what this trial is actually about. Not punishment, not revenge. It is about silence. It is about what a government hides when it knows what it has done cannot be defended, and what happens when the wall of silence finally comes down. 8 American airmen were captured by the Japanese military in April of 1942 after the most audacious air raid of the Pacific War. Within 6 months of their capture, 3 of them were dead by firing squad. A 4th would die of starvation and disease in a prison cell. The other 4 would spend 40 months in solitary confinement, beaten, starved, and sick with dysentery and beriberi, not knowing from one day to the next whether they would be taken out and shot. And for nearly the entire duration of the war, the Japanese government refused to say what had happened to any of them. Not to the International Committee of the Red Cross, not to the Swiss intermediaries who handled communications between warring nations, not to the United States government, which asked repeatedly through every available diplomatic channel for information about its missing airmen. Japan's official position was silence. Total, deliberate, administrative silence, maintained for years, across multiple agencies, without exception. The families received nothing, no confirmation of capture, no notification of execution, no notification of death by disease. No names, no locations, no status. For more than 3 years, the mothers and fathers and wives of those 8 men lived in a space between hope and grief that had no resolution, because the nation holding their sons and husbands refused to acknowledge that it was holding them at all. The trial unfolding in this Shanghai courtroom in February of 1946, formally titled United States versus Sawada, is the moment that silence finally breaks open. And what comes out of it? The testimony, the recovered documents, the letters never delivered, the cremation urns deliberately mislabeled to hide identities, will reveal not just what happened to 8 men, but what happens when a military system decides that the rules of war apply only to the enemy and that justice is whatever the powerful say it is. To understand how Chase Nielsen ended up in that witness chair, and to understand why the Japanese officers across from him kept their silence for so long, we need to go back, not to the moment Nielsen was captured, not even to the morning he climbed into a bomber on the pitching deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We need to go back to a Sunday morning in December of 1941, to a military base in Oregon, where a young corporal named Jacob DeShazer was peeling potatoes on kitchen duty when someone ran into the room and told him the Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. DeShazer put down the potato peeler. By his own account, repeated in interviews and writings for the rest of his life, he said out loud, "Japan is going to pay for this." 4 months later, he was a volunteer bombardier on the most dangerous mission the United States Army Air Forces had yet conceived. 5 months after that, he was a prisoner of the Japanese military, locked in a cell so small he could not fully stand up straight, serving a sentence under a law that had not existed when he committed the act he was being punished for. This is the story of those 8 men. It is the story of what was done to them, what was hidden about them, and what a military tribunal finally uncovered when the nation that held them could no longer refuse to explain. It is also, in its final chapter, a story about what revenge looks like when it transforms into something no one anticipated, something that nobody in that Shanghai courtroom in 1946, least of all the Japanese officers at the defense table, could have predicted. It begins with an idea so reckless that even the man who proposed it was not entirely sure it could work. In January of 1942, the United States was losing the Pacific War on every front. Pearl Harbor had crippled the Pacific Fleet. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had surrendered on December 23rd. Guam had been taken on December 10th. Singapore was about to fall to the Japanese 25th Army. Japan controlled a territory stretching from the coast of Burma to the islands of the Central Pacific, and there was no realistic way for the United States to strike back at the Japanese homeland. American bombers did not have the range. American carriers could not get close enough to the Japanese islands without being detected and sunk. The homeland of the Japanese Empire was, for all practical purposes, untouchable. A Navy captain named Francis Lowe had a different opinion. Lowe had watched Army medium bombers practicing simulated attacks on the outline of a carrier deck painted on a runway in Norfolk, Virginia. He noticed that the bombers, B-25s, needed less runway to get airborne than anyone had assumed. He asked a question that would change the trajectory of the war. What if you loaded Army bombers onto a Navy carrier and launched them at Japan from the open Pacific? The idea was, by any reasonable standard, absurd. B-25s had never taken off from an aircraft carrier. They were too heavy to land on one. It would be a one-way mission. The crews would have to bomb Japan and then fly more than 1,000 miles westward to China, hoping to reach airfields in Chiang Kai-shek's territory before they ran out of fuel. If anything went wrong with the timing, the fuel calculations, the weather, or the arrangements on the Chinese end, the crews would be on their own in enemy-held territory with no way home and no rescue plan. The man chosen to plan and lead the mission was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, an MIT-trained aeronautical engineer, a record-setting racing pilot, and one of the most accomplished aviators in American history. Doolittle hand-picked 80 men, 5 for each of 16 B-25, B. Mitchell bombers. The volunteers were told only that the mission was dangerous, that it was important, and that it involved flying a B-25 off a surface considerably shorter than any runway they had ever used. Many of them did not learn the actual target until they were at sea. They trained in secret for weeks at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing short takeoffs from runways marked with white lines to simulate the length of a carrier deck, low-altitude navigation over the Gulf of Mexico, and long-range fuel management techniques that required them to lean the fuel mixture far beyond what the manufacturer recommended. The bombers were stripped of every unnecessary pound. Extra fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bays and fuselage. The lower gun turrets were removed entirely. In their place, broomsticks were painted black and mounted in the tail to simulate rear-facing guns, because the actual tail guns had been sacrificed to save weight. On April 2, 1942, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet sailed from Alameda Naval Air Station in San Francisco Bay with 16 B-25s lashed to its flight deck. Task Force 16, under Admiral William F. Halsey, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, provided fighter cover and escort. The plan was to close to within 400 nautical miles of Japan, launch the bombers at dusk so they would reach Tokyo under cover of darkness, bomb military and industrial targets, and fly on to designated airfields in the Chinese provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. The plan did not survive contact with reality. On the morning of April 18, 1942, still approximately 650 nautical miles from the Japanese coast, the task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat, the No. 23 Nito Maru. The patrol boat was sunk by gunfire from the cruiser USS Nashville, but not before it transmitted a contact report. Doolittle and the Hornet's captain, Mark Mitchell, faced a decision that could not be deferred for even an hour. If they continued to close the distance, the element of surprise would be gone, and the carriers themselves would be at risk. If they launched now, the bombers would be taking off 10 hours ahead of schedule, 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than planned, in daylight instead of darkness, into headwinds that would burn fuel faster than any calculation had allowed for. Everyone on that flight deck understood what the extra distance meant. The bombers would almost certainly not have enough fuel to reach the Chinese airfields. Every crew that took off was accepting the probability that they would run dry somewhere over occupied China or the East China Sea. Doolittle did not hesitate. All 16 bombers launched successfully between 0820 and 0919 that morning. Doolittle himself went first. They reached the Japanese home islands around noon and hit targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The physical damage was modest. A few factories hit, a few oil storage facilities damaged, some buildings destroyed, about 50 Japanese killed and several hundred wounded. But the psychological impact was immense and far out of proportion to the material damage. The Japanese military and government had told the Japanese people that the homeland was impregnable, that the sacred islands of Japan could never be reached by enemy aircraft. The Imperial Navy had guaranteed the security of the homeland's skies. 16 American bombers, launched from a carrier that was not supposed to be able to carry them, had just proved, in broad daylight over the capital city, that every one of those assurances was a lie. Japanese civilians looked up and saw American aircraft over Tokyo for the first time in the history of the nation. The shock was not about the bombs. The shock was about the fact that the Americans had come at all. The raid humiliated the Japanese High Command. It produced a crisis of confidence at the highest levels of the Imperial General Staff, and it contributed directly to the fateful decision to overextend the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, a battle that Japan lost decisively and that became the turning point of the entire Pacific War. Historians have argued for decades about how much the Doolittle Raid influenced the decision to attack Midway, but the consensus is clear. The raid forced the Japanese Navy to prioritize eliminating the American carrier threat, and that urgency led them into a battle they were not prepared to fight. But for 80 men in 16 bombers now flying west over the Pacific toward China, with fuel gauges dropping steadily toward empty, the consequences of April 18th were immediate, personal, and, for some of them, fatal. 15 of the 16 aircraft crashed, ditched in the ocean, or were abandoned in mid-air as fuel ran out over China. One bomber, low on fuel and unable to reach China, diverted north and landed at an airfield near Vladivostok in the Soviet Union. Its crew was interned for more than a year. Most of the remaining crews parachuted or crash-landed into Chinese-held territory and were helped to safety by Chinese civilians and soldiers, often at tremendous personal risk to those Chinese helpers. The Japanese military, enraged that the Chinese population had aided the American flyers, launched a massive retaliatory campaign across the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, known as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Campaign. Japanese forces swept through villages and towns along the possible escape routes of the American bombers. Anyone suspected of helping the Americans was executed. Entire communities were burned. Wells were poisoned. Crops were destroyed. The campaign killed tens of thousands of Chinese civilians at minimum, with estimates ranging as high as 250,000, a figure first recorded by a Vincentian priest named Father Vincent Smith and later cited by General Claire Chennault and multiple post-war historians. The Chinese people paid for the Doolittle Raid with a price that dwarfs anything the raiders themselves endured, and that price has never been fully acknowledged in the Western telling of this story. 3 Doolittle Raiders were killed on April 18th, 1 in a parachute accident and 2 drowning during a water landing. 69 made it to safety or internment. 8 did not. 2 crews fell into Japanese hands, and the men on those 2 aircraft are the 8 at the center of this investigation. Let me tell you who they were, because who they were before the war matters as much as what was done to them during it. Crew 6 was nicknamed the Green Hornet. Its pilot was Lieutenant Dean Edward Hallmark, 28 years old, born January 20th, 1914, in Robert Lee, a small town in West Texas. Hallmark was big, athletic, a former football player who had attended Auburn University. He was the kind of man other men followed instinctively. The Green Hornet was forced to ditch in the ocean off the coast near Wenzhou, China, when its fuel ran out. 2 crew members, Sergeant William Dieter and Sergeant Donald Fitzmaurice, drowned in the ditching. Hallmark, the navigator Chase Nielsen, and the co-pilot Robert Meader were pulled from the water and captured by Japanese forces on April 27th. Lieutenant Robert John Meader, the co-pilot, was 24 years old, born August 23, 1917, in Cleveland, Ohio. He had been a cheerleader at Lakewood High School, a graduate of Miami University of Ohio, and by all accounts a deeply optimistic young man who talked frequently about what he planned to do after the war. He wanted, according to his fellow prisoners, to start a furniture business in Lakewood. Lieutenant Chase J. Nielsen, the navigator, was 25, born January 14, 1917, in Hiram, Utah, a small farming town in Cache Valley. He had worked his way through Utah State and earned a degree in civil engineering. He was quiet, precise, and observant, the kind of man who noticed details and remembered them. That capacity for precise memory would become, 4 years later, the prosecution's most important weapon in the Shanghai courtroom. Crew 16 was nicknamed the Bat Out of Hell. It was the last B-25 off the Hornet that morning, the 16th bomber to roar down the flight deck and lift into the Pacific headwind. Its pilot was Lieutenant William Glover Farrow, 23 years old, born September 24, 1918, in Darlington, South Carolina. Farrow was an Eagle Scout, raised in a close family by his mother Jessie, who had instilled in him a faith and a gentleness that would show itself, remarkably, in the last letter he ever wrote. Its co-pilot was Lieutenant Robert Leland Height, 22, from Odell, Texas. Its navigator was Lieutenant George Barr, 25, born April 6, 1917, in Brooklyn, New York. Barr was an orphan who had found his place through athletics, becoming a star basketball player at Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. He was strong and self-reliant and had no family to fall back on except the men around him. Its bombardier was Corporal Jacob Daniel DeShazer, 29, born November 15, 1912, in West Staten, Oregon, the farmer's son, the man peeling potatoes when Pearl Harbor was announced, the man who said Japan was going to pay, and its engineer-gunner was Sergeant Harold Althouse Spatz, 21 years old, born July 14, 1921, in Lebo, Kansas. Spatz was quiet, steady, and private. His mother had been killed in an accident involving a car and a trolley when he was about 6 years old. He had grown up without her. All 5 members of Crew 16 bailed out over Japanese-occupied territory in China and were captured. 8 Americans, average age, roughly 25, from Texas and Ohio and Brooklyn and Kansas and Oregon and Utah and South Carolina. Before the war, they had been students and athletes and farm boys and small-town kids from places most people could not find on a map. None of them were career military officers. None of them had planned on becoming prisoners of war, and none of them had the faintest idea what was about to be done to them under a law that did not yet exist. What happened next is the part of this story that the Japanese government kept silent about for more than 3 years, and that Chase Nielsen, sitting in that witness chair in 1946, came back to Shanghai to say out loud. The 8 men were taken to Shanghai and turned over to the Kempei Tai, the Japanese military police, who served as the military's secret police and intelligence arm. They were first held at Bridge House, a building that had become infamous among Shanghai's international community as a place where prisoners entered and sometimes did not come out. Later they were moved to Qiangwan Military Prison, where they would remain for the longer term. During the initial weeks of interrogation, they were beaten. They were subjected to the water cure, the technique that Nielsen would later describe in precise detail at the tribunal. The prisoner is laid flat on his back. His arms and legs are restrained. A cloth or towel is placed over his face. Water is poured continuously over the cloth, into the nose and mouth, until the prisoner's body begins to react as though it is drowning. The sensation is not simulated. The body is actually drowning. The difference between the water cure and actual drowning is measured in seconds and in the willingness of the interrogator to stop. Nielsen later testified that the torture sessions continued for days. He described being strapped to a wooden frame with his arms pulled behind him. He described the water being forced into him until he lost consciousness. He described waking and having the questions resume immediately. The interrogators wanted to know where the bombers had launched from. They wanted the target list. They wanted the names of everyone involved in planning the mission. The raiders had been briefed before the mission on how to handle capture. They gave name, rank, and serial number. The interrogators responded by escalating the torture. But the interrogation was, in a sense, secondary to a decision that had already been made at the highest levels of the Japanese government. The Doolittle Raid had humiliated Japan. It had shattered the myth of homeland invulnerability. Someone had to be punished for that humiliation, publicly and permanently. And since Doolittle and the rest of the raiders could not be reached, the 8 men already in Japanese custody would serve as the example. On August 13, 1942, General Shunroku Hata, the Supreme Commander of Japanese forces in China, promulgated a regulation formerly known as Military Order No. 4, which would become known as the Enemy Airmen's Act. It stated that any enemy airman who attacked civilians or non-military targets in Japanese-held territory was subject to the death penalty, and it contained a single clause that violates a principle so fundamental to civilized law that it has been recognized by legal systems across the world for centuries. The clause stated that the regulation shall be applicable to all acts committed prior to the date of its approval. Read that sentence one more time. The law was written to apply backward in time. It was designed and intended to convict men for actions taken months before the law existed. It was, by its own explicit text, an ex post facto regulation. It was created specifically and solely to provide a legal framework for executing the Doolittle Raiders. Without that retroactive clause, there was no law under which the 8 Americans could be charged with anything. With it, they were already guilty before the ink was dry. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo ordered the regulation made retroactive. He admitted this at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East after the war. He said he did so as a deterrent, to prevent future raids on the Japanese homeland. He used 8 prisoners of war as a warning sign to the United States. The chief of the Japanese General Staff, General Hajime Sugiyama, went further. He demanded the death penalty for all aviators who bombed Japan, every one of them, without exception. On August 28, 1942, the 8 Americans were brought before a Japanese military tribunal in Shanghai. By some accounts, the proceeding lasted roughly an hour, by others, no more than 20 minutes. Either way, 8 men charged with offences carrying the death penalty were tried collectively in a single brief session. The men were not informed of the charges against them. They were not provided with defence counsel. They were not given an interpreter or any translation of the proceedings. No evidence was presented that they could examine or challenge. No witnesses were called on their behalf. They could not understand the language being spoken around them. They sat in a room, while men in Japanese military uniforms spoke, gestured at documents, and reached conclusions that would determine whether the 8 Americans lived or died. At least one of them, Dean Hallmark, was too ill from the weeks of torture and malnutrition to meaningfully participate in anything. Several of them did not fully understand that they had been tried at all until long afterward, when other prisoners or guards explained what had happened. All 8 were sentenced to death. The sentences were forwarded to Tokyo for review. Prime Minister Tojo urged that 5 of the death sentences be commuted, reportedly fearing reprisals against Japanese prisoners held by the Allies. Emperor Hirohito ordered the commutation, reducing 5 sentences to life imprisonment with special treatment, a vague phrase that in practice meant solitary confinement and starvation rations. The other 3 sentences, those of Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz, were allowed to stand. Why the emperor spared 5 and not the other 3 has never been definitively explained. Documents relating to his decision were reportedly destroyed in 1945. On October 15, 1942, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were taken from their cells and transported to Public Cemetery No. 1 at Qiangwan, on the outskirts of Shanghai. They were led to an open area within the cemetery grounds. They were made to kneel. Their arms were bound. They were tied to wooden stakes set into the ground. They were blindfolded. Black ink marks were drawn on their foreheads over the blindfolds to serve as aiming points for the firing squad, and they were shot. Dean Hallmark was 28 years old. William Farrow was 24. Harold Spatz was 21. Spatz had been alive for 21 years, and for the last 5 months of those years, he had been beaten, starved, subjected to a trial he could not understand in a language he did not speak, and condemned to death under a law that had been invented for the sole purpose of killing him. Their bodies were cremated. The urns containing their ashes were deliberately mislabeled by Japanese authorities. Spatz's remains were filed under the false name E.L. Brister. The mislabeling was intentional, designed to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to identify or recover the remains after the war. William Farrow, the Eagle Scout from South Carolina, wrote a farewell letter to his mother Jessie the night before his execution. The letter was confiscated by Japanese authorities immediately after he wrote it. It was never mailed. It was never delivered. It was held in Japanese custody for the remainder of the war. It would not be recovered until American investigators found it in 1945. In the letter, Farrow wrote, "Do not let this get you down. Just remember God will make everything right, and that I will see you all again in the hereafter. So let me implore you to keep your chin up." He closed the letter with a line that has stayed with everyone who has ever read it. He wrote, "My faith in God is complete, so I am unafraid." He was 24 years old when he wrote those words. He knew he would be shot the next day. His mother Jessie, in Darlington, South Carolina, would not learn what had happened to her son for more than 3 years. She spent those years not knowing whether he was alive or dead, because the Japanese government refused to tell her. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the names of men like Farrow and Hallmark and Spatz, men whose stories most people have never heard, visible for a little while longer. That matters more than I can say. The 5 surviving prisoners, Nielsen, Meader, Haidt, Barr and DeShazer, remained at Qiangwan Military Prison near Shanghai. In April of 1943, they were transferred to a prison in Nanking, China, where conditions grew even worse. Their death sentences had been commuted to life imprisonment, but the conditions of that imprisonment were designed, whether by deliberate policy or by systematic indifference, to kill them slowly. They were placed in solitary confinement in individual cells. The cells were small enough that a man could barely move, could not fully stretch out, and could not stand upright. They were fed starvation rations, usually a small portion of rice and some water, sometimes a few vegetables. They were denied medical attention even as their health deteriorated. They suffered from dysentery that left them dehydrated and weak. They developed beriberi from the nutritional deficiency. Their weight dropped until their bones protruded visibly through their skin. They were beaten periodically, sometimes for violating rules they had not been told existed, sometimes for no stated reason at all. They could hear each other through the thin cell walls. They communicated by tapping, sometimes in Morse code, sometimes in improvised patterns. It was their only human contact for months at a stretch. Robert Meader, the cheerleader from Lakewood, Ohio, the optimist who had talked through the cell wall about starting a furniture business after the war, did not survive the imprisonment. He died on December 1, 1943, in the Nanking prison, of a combination of malnutrition, beriberi, and dysentery. He was 26 years old. His tapping on the wall had grown weaker in the weeks before his death. Then it stopped. The men in the cells around his did not immediately know he was dead. They knew only that the tapping had stopped. His death may have been the only reason the other 4 survived. According to the accounts of the survivors, the Japanese prison authorities, perhaps alarmed that another death would attract unwanted scrutiny from higher headquarters or from international observers, marginally improved the conditions for the remaining 4 prisoners after Meader died. The food increased slightly, and, critically, a Bible was provided to the prisoners. That Bible would change everything for one of the 4 men, but the story of what it did to Jacob DeShazer is a story for later in this investigation. For now, what matters is the scale of what the remaining 4 men endured. They spent 40 months in captivity, 40 months in cells barely large enough to lie down in, 40 months with almost no information about the outside world, about the progress of the war, about whether anyone on the American side even knew they were alive. 40 months of not knowing, on any given morning, whether that day would be the day they were taken from their cells and shot the way Hallmark and Farrow and Spatz had been shot. Robert Hite's weight fell from approximately 180 pounds to 76 pounds. He was, by the time of liberation, essentially a skeleton with skin. George Barr, the orphan from Brooklyn, the basketball player who had built himself into a strong and self-reliant young man, was so physically and psychologically destroyed by the captivity that when an American Office of Strategic Services team reached the survivors on August 20, 1945, he had to be carried out. He was so disoriented that he was initially, and mistakenly, placed in a psychiatric ward rather than a medical ward. It took the personal intervention of General Jimmy Doolittle himself, the man who had led the raid that put Barr in that cell, to get him transferred to proper care. But they survived. All 4 of them walked out of that prison, barely, into a world that had changed completely in the years they had been locked away. Now here is what the American people were told during the war, and here is the silence that the Shanghai Tribunal was built to break. On October 19, 1942, 4 days after the executions at Kiangwan, the Japanese government issued a single public announcement through official channels. It stated that certain enemy airmen had been tried by military tribunal and sentenced. It provided no names. It provided no details about the charges. It did not specify how many men had been tried. It did not state what the individual sentences were. It did not mention that 3 men had already been executed 4 days earlier. The United States government, operating through the Swiss government, acting as the protecting power for American interests in Japan, requested information about the captured airmen. Japan refused to respond. The International Committee of the Red Cross requested access to the prisoners. Japan denied the request. For the remainder of the war, the Japanese government's position was that the matter had been handled in accordance with Japanese military law and that no further information would be provided to any party. The families of the 8 men heard nothing. Dean Hallmark's family in Robert Lee, Texas, did not know whether their son was alive or dead. William Farrow's mother, Jessie, did not receive the farewell letter her son had written the night before his execution. Harold Spatz's family in Kansas did not know that his body had been cremated and his ashes filed under a false name. The families of Nielsen, Meader, Hite, Barr, and DeShazer did not know where their men were held, or in what condition, or whether they would ever see them again. This silence was not an accident. It was not a bureaucratic failure. It was policy, maintained deliberately across multiple levels of the Japanese government and military for more than 3 years. When President Franklin Roosevelt received intelligence suggesting that some of the captured airmen had been executed, he made a public statement in April of 1943 confirming that the Japanese government had carried out executions of American aviators and calling the act barbarous. But he did not have names. He did not have documentation. He did not have proof, because Japan had constructed a wall of official silence around the entire episode that would not be broken until the war ended and American investigators could physically enter the places where the men had been held and the executions had been carried out. That breaking open began in the autumn of 1945. American war crimes investigators, working through the legal apparatus established in the Pacific after Japan's surrender, began tracing the full record of what had happened. They recovered documents from Japanese military files. They found the mislabeled cremation urns at Kiangwan. They found Farrow's farewell letter, still held in Japanese military custody, never mailed to his mother. They identified the officers who had presided over the sham tribunal in August of 1942. They mapped the entire chain of command, from the prison guards in Shanghai up through Lieutenant General Shigeru Sawada, the commander of the 13th Army, through General Hata, the supreme commander in China, through General Sugiyama, the chief of the General Staff, to Prime Minister Tojo himself. And they found 4 living survivors who could describe, in their own words and under oath, exactly what had been done. The trial, formally designated United States versus Shigeru Sawada and others, convened in Shanghai in February of 1946. It was a United States military commission. The prosecution charged 4 Japanese officers with responsibility for the unlawful trial and execution of the Doolittle Raiders. Lieutenant General Shigeru Sawada, commander of the 13th Army, under whose authority the prisoners had been held and tried. Captain Yusei Wako, the judge advocate who had presided over the sham tribunal that sentenced the 8 men to death in 1 hour. Lieutenant Ryuhei Okada, the military prosecutor who had presented the case against the airmen in that proceeding. And Captain Sotojiro Tatsuta, the prison warden who had overseen the transport and execution of Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz at Kiangwan. The defense was led by Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Bodine and attorney Charles Fellows. They mounted a serious and, in some respects, a compelling legal argument. Their central claim was that the 4 defendants had acted under superior orders, that Sawada himself had protested the death sentences and been directly overruled by Tokyo, and that the men in the dock were functionaries carrying out decisions made by leaders who were being tried separately at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The defense was not entirely wrong. Sawada had protested. He had been overruled. The order to execute 3 of the 8 men had come from above him. But the commission's task was to determine whether the men in this courtroom had participated in the unlawful trial and killing of prisoners of war. And on that question, the evidence was not ambiguous. Chase Nielsen took the witness stand. He described his capture in April of 1942. He described the weeks of interrogation at Bridge House in Shanghai. He described, in controlled and precise language, the water cure. He told the commission he had been laid on his back, and that a towel had been placed over his face, and that water had been poured over the towel until he could not breathe, until he lost consciousness, until he felt as though he were caught between life and death, with no control over which side he would land on. He described regaining consciousness and having the same questions asked again. He described the process repeating until the interrogators were satisfied, or until he passed out again. He described the sham trial, how he had been brought into a room, how Japanese was spoken around him that no one translated, how documents were presented that he could not read, how he was taken back to his cell afterward without any understanding that he had just been sentenced to death. He described the conditions of imprisonment, the starvation rations, the cells, the solitary confinement that stretched from weeks into months into years. He described Robert Meader's slow deterioration in the cell beside him, the tapping on the wall growing weaker over the final weeks, the silence when it stopped. He described learning, only upon liberation in August of 1945, that Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz had been executed nearly 3 years earlier. The courtroom listened. Robert Haidt also gave testimony and provided sworn statements. Haidt, the man who had been little more than a skeleton when American forces found him, described the same conditions and the same daily uncertainty about whether the next morning would bring a bowl of rice or a firing squad. Years later, speaking publicly about his captivity, Haidt said plainly what the trial record confirmed. He said, "We were war criminals according to the Japanese because we had attacked their homeland. To save face, they had to designate someone responsible and execute them." That single sentence cuts through every legal technicality the defense raised. The 8 men were not tried because they had committed a crime recognized by any legitimate legal system. They were tried because Japan needed someone to punish. The law was written after the act. The trial was a performance staged for bureaucratic purposes. The sentences were a political decision dressed up in legal language. On April 15, 1946, the military commission delivered its verdict. All 4 defendants were found guilty. The sentences, however, were not what anyone who had listened to Nielsen's testimony might have expected. Captain Yusei Wako, who had presided over the sham trial that sentenced 3 men to death and 5 more to life imprisonment, in 1 hour, without defense or translation, received 9 years at hard labor. Lieutenant General Sawada received 5 years. Lieutenant Okada received 5 years. Captain Tatsuta, the man who had overseen the execution of 3 bound and blindfolded prisoners of war, received 5 years. 5 years for overseeing the killing of 3 men who had committed no recognized crime, 9 years for conducting a trial that had no legal standing. A War Department review later examined the sentences and concluded, in its exact official language, that they were extremely lenient and the product of a serious error of judgment. But the review also concluded that ordering a retrial would violate the legal principle against double jeopardy. The sentences stood. And these were not the worst failures of accountability in the chain of command. General Sadamu Shimomura, who replaced Sawada as commander of the 13th Army and who was reported to have signed the actual execution order, was shielded from prosecution by American occupation intelligence officials, including General Charles Willoughby, and never served a single day in prison. The higher authorities, Tojo and Hata, did face trial at the International Military Tribunal. Tojo was convicted on multiple counts and hanged on December 23, 1948. Hata was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but was paroled in 1955. The Doolittle Raiders case was not an isolated event. It was the template. The Enemy Airmen's Act that Tojo ordered written to justify executing 8 men in 1942 became the legal framework under which Japan executed captured Allied airmen for the rest of the war. An estimated 132 Allied airmen shot down over Japan in 1944 and 1945 were killed following summary proceedings. At Fukuoka, 33 American airmen were deliberately killed, including 15 who were beheaded after Japan's intention to surrender had already been announced on August 15, 1945. Lieutenant General Tasuku Okada, who commanded the Tokai military district and ordered the summary execution of dozens of captured B-29 crewmen, was tried at the Yokohama War Crimes Tribunal. At his trial, he said that beheading was a time-honored way of execution based on Bushido, the way of the samurai. He was hanged in 1949. And in a separate case that had nothing to do with the Doolittle Raiders, but everything to do with the pattern they had established, 8 surviving crewmen from a different B-29, shot down over southern Japan in May of 1945, were taken not to a prisoner camp, but to Kyushu Imperial University's College of Medicine, where they were subjected to experimental surgeries, from which none of them survived. The men had parachuted from their bomber after it was rammed by a Japanese fighter over Takiarai Airfield on Kyushu. Their aircraft commander, Captain Marvin Watkins, was separated from the others and sent to Tokyo, where he was tortured but survived the war. His 8 crewmen were not as fortunate. Between late May and early June of 1945, they were taken one by one to the anatomy department of the medical school. They cooperated with the men in white coats because they believed they were receiving medical treatment. They were not. A medical student named Toshio Tono, who witnessed what happened, said years later, "It is because the prisoners thought that we were doctors, since they could see the white smocks that they did not struggle. They never dreamed they would be dissected." 30 people connected to those events were tried at the Yokohama Tribunal. 23 were convicted. 5 were sentenced to death. Not one of those death sentences was carried out. As the Cold War intensified, and Japan became a strategic ally against the Soviet Union and Communist China, General Douglas MacArthur commuted most of the sentences in 1950. By 1958, every person convicted in the Kyushu case was free. If your father or grandfather or great-grandfather served in the Pacific, in any branch, in any unit, in any theater of operations, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit they were in, where they served, what they remembered, or what they told you. The official records tell one version of the war. The men who fought it carried another version, the real version, and those stories deserve to be preserved by the families who still carry them. Now, there is one more part of this story, and it is the part I keep coming back to every time I revisit this investigation, because it is the part that nobody in that Shanghai courtroom, not the prosecutors, not the judges, not the defendants, could have seen coming. Jacob DeShazer spent 40 months in Japanese captivity. 34 of those months were in solitary confinement. He was beaten. He was starved. He watched Robert Meader die in the cell beside him, heard the tapping fade to nothing. He had no contact with his family. He did not know if anyone in the world knew he was alive. In 1944, the surviving prisoners were briefly given access to a Bible. DeShazer had it for approximately 3 weeks before it was taken away. In that time, by his own account, given consistently in interviews and writings for the rest of his life, he read it from Genesis to Revelation and experienced a spiritual conversion that altered the entire trajectory of his existence. He described it not as a sudden flash of insight, but as a gradual dismantling of the hatred he had carried since the morning of Pearl Harbor. He had entered captivity wanting Japan to pay. He had spent more than 2 years in a cell nursing that anger, letting it sustain him through the beatings and the hunger and the darkness. And then, reading in a prison cell in China, he came to the conclusion that hatred was not sustaining him at all. It was consuming him. The man who had said Japan is going to pay for this decided, in the most unlikely of settings, that what he actually wanted was not vengeance but reconciliation, not punishment for the men who had hurt him, but forgiveness of them. It was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable personal transformations to come out of the Second World War. After liberation, DeShazer went home to Oregon. He enrolled at Seattle Pacific College. He married a woman named Florence Matheny, and then, in December of 1948, he went back to Japan. Not as a soldier, not as a war crimes investigator, not as a man seeking justice or retribution. He went back as a Free Methodist missionary. He spent 30 years in Japan, the country that had imprisoned and tortured him, founding churches, learning the language, and preaching a message of reconciliation to the people of the nation that had taken away years of his life. He wrote a tract about his experience, called I Was a Prisoner of Japan. It was a short pamphlet, written in plain language, describing what had happened to him and how his hatred had transformed into something else in a prison cell in China. The tract was translated into Japanese and circulated widely in post-war Japan, a country that was itself struggling to make sense of what the war had done and what it had cost. More than 1 million copies were distributed in Japan alone, by ministry estimates, and one of the men who picked up a copy and read it was a retired Imperial Japanese Navy captain named Mitsuo Fuchida. Fuchida was not an ordinary veteran. He was the man who commanded the first wave of 183 aircraft in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He was the pilot who flew over the harbor and confirmed that the attack had achieved total surprise, transmitting the famous signal, Tora, Tora, Tora. He was, in the most direct and literal sense imaginable, the man who started the war that put Jacob DeShazer in a prison cell. Fuchida read the tract. By his own later testimony, it was one of the experiences that led to his conversion to Christianity in 1949. The two men met in 1950. They became friends, and on various occasions in the years that followed, the lead pilot of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Doolittle Raider who had sworn revenge for Pearl Harbor appeared together, speaking at churches and peace events, telling a story that no screenwriter would dare invent because no audience would believe it. The man who launched the war and the man who swore to make Japan pay for launching it, standing side by side, telling people that what had happened between them did not have to be the end of the story. Chase Nielsen, the navigator who came back to Shanghai to sit 12 feet from the men who had tortured him and describe what they did in a voice steady enough to enter a legal record, made a career in the United States Air Force. He served in Strategic Air Command during the Cold War, flying missions most Americans never heard about, in an organization built to deter the kind of conflict that had produced his captivity. He retired with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He died on March 23, 2007, at the age of 90, in a country he had spent his adult life defending. He never said publicly whether he believed justice had been done in that Shanghai courtroom. Those who knew him believed he did not. Robert Hite, the co-pilot from Odell, Texas, whose weight had dropped to 76 pounds during more than 3 years of imprisonment, recovered slowly after liberation. He was recalled to military service during the Korean War, served again, and later went into the hotel business. He lived longer than any of the other 7 captured raiders. He died on March 29, 2015, at the age of 95, the last living witness to what had been done to the 8. In one of his final public interviews, he said that the Japanese needed someone to blame for the humiliation of the Doolittle Raid. and that the 8 captured men were simply the most convenient targets available. George Barr, the orphan from Brooklyn who arrived at liberation so physically and mentally broken that he was placed in a psychiatric ward, fought his way back to a functional life with the same toughness that had made him a college athlete. He earned a master's degree from Columbia University, rebuilt what the captivity had dismantled, and died of heart failure in 1967 at the age of 50. He was the youngest of the survivors to die. Those who knew him believed the years in that cell had taken more from his body than any amount of recovery could restore. Jacob DeShazer died on March 15, 2008, at the age of 95, in Salem, Oregon. He had spent 3 decades in the country that imprisoned him, speaking the language of the people who had beaten him, and preaching forgiveness to anyone who would listen. Dean Hallmark's ashes were recovered by American investigators after the war and interred at Arlington National Cemetery in January of 1949. William Farrow was also brought home to Arlington. Harold Spatz, the quiet young man from Kansas, whose remains had been cremated and filed under the false name E. L. Brister, was eventually identified through the records uncovered by the Tribunal and laid to rest at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. Robert Meader, the cheerleader from Cleveland who died tapping plans for a furniture store on the wall of his cell, was buried at Arlington. The farewell letter that William Farrow wrote to his mother on the eve of his execution was finally delivered to Jessie Farrow after the war. She had waited more than 3 years to learn what happened to her son. The letter she finally received had been written by a 24-year-old boy who knew he was going to die the next morning and whose last thought, committed to paper in a prison cell, was to tell his mother to keep her chin up. So here is the answer to the question this investigation was built to ask. What did the Tribunal uncover when Japan refused to explain what happened to 8 captured American pilots? It uncovered a law written backward in time to punish men for something that was not a crime when they did it. It uncovered a trial that lasted no more than an hour, in a language the defendants could not understand, with no defense, no translation, and no legitimate legal standing. It uncovered 3 executions carried out in a public cemetery, with bound men kneeling at wooden stakes and ink marks drawn on their foreheads as targets. It uncovered cremation urns filed under false names to prevent identification. It uncovered a farewell letter confiscated and hidden for years. It uncovered 40 months of starvation, solitary confinement, and systematic abuse inflicted on men whose only act was volunteering for a mission their country asked them to fly. And it uncovered a silence, maintained deliberately and systematically for years, designed to make sure that no one outside the Japanese military would ever learn what had been done. The Tribunal broke the silence, but it could not undo what the silence had already accomplished. 3 men were dead before anyone outside the Japanese military knew they had been sentenced. A 4th died in a cell without the world knowing his name. 4 survived by margins so thin that survival itself was almost accidental, and they emerged into a world that would take years to understand the full scope of what they had endured. The men who designed the retroactive law, the men who presided over the sham trial, the men who carried out the executions, were held accountable only partially. The sentences were light. The commutations came quickly. The Cold War replaced the appetite for justice with the need for strategic allies, and within a decade, most of the men convicted across the Pacific for crimes against Allied airmen were free. But the 8 men at the center of this story were not legal abstractions. They were 21 and 28 and 25 years old. They were from Robert Lee and Cleveland and Brooklyn and Lebo and West Dayton and Hiram and Darlington. They were students and athletes and farmers and sons, and they volunteered for a mission that everyone involved knew might kill them. When it did not kill them in the air, it killed 3 of them on the ground, in a cemetery, bound and blindfolded, under a law that was written for no other purpose than to make their deaths look legal. The Tribunal uncovered all of this. What it could not deliver was justice equal to what it found. And perhaps that is why the part of this story that has stayed with me longest is not the courtroom in Shanghai. It is the farmer's son from Oregon who went back to Japan carrying a Bible instead of a bomb, and the fighter pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor and ended up standing beside him, Two men on opposite sides of the worst war in human history, both of them saying the same thing, both of them saying that the final word did not have to be written in anger. If this investigation gave you something to think about, subscribe. There are more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men in uniforms, who at one moment in their lives faced something that should have destroyed them. Some of those men were destroyed by it, some of them were not. The difference was never rank. It was never training. It was something inside them that no tribunal could measure and no cell could reach. And they deserve to be remembered not only for what was done to them, but for what they chose to do with their lives afterward.